My name is Andrew Chatham. I was RSI in 97. I credit RSI to teaching me I did not like doing biology. I loved it otherwise. I then went to Duke, where I majored in computer science and economics, and then graduated into the dot-com bust. Nobody was hiring except for Google. There are many Rickoids have worked at Google. I'm pretty sure I was the first one. So I enjoyed that, and I basically never left and then transformed into Waymo, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. All right, I'm expecting an audience full of armchair driverless car enthusiasts. I've been working on this for almost 15 years now, and I'm really proud of how far we've come, and just want to kind of share the history of autonomous vehicles and kind of what we've come from. So, which button do I push? Maybe not. All right, well, I don't mind hitting an arrow. Is this thingy?
It might not be happy over there.
Oh, I don't have a, that's okay.
I can run it.
Sure, all right. Which button works? That could be our problem. Well, let's click there. All right, so we'll just click on that. All right, so here's a picture from 1950 advertisement, just kind of showing that people cared about driving autonomously for a very long time. You can see this family is playing dominoes, which does not seem like the best game to play in a car, no matter how it's driven. But just going back decades, people have been wanting to do this. And there's been earlier research into autonomous vehicles and robotic driving for a very long time, but it didn't really get started until later. Why do people care? A lot of people die is probably the biggest reason. There are many reasons we would want to take humans out of the loop of driving, but probably the biggest one is safety. Over 1 million people die each year across the world. In automobile accidents in the United States, it's a little over 40,000. We had a really good trend where that was going down almost to 30,000, and then it spiked back up. Sort of post-COVID, we've had a big regression in terms of the number of deaths in automobile accidents. Next slide. All right, so, that was a couple. So the first really serious attempt at autonomous driving was the DARPA Grand Challenge, the DARPA Desert Challenge, where DARPA, the research branch of the US military, sponsored a contest that was entered by various academics and corporations to drive 150 miles through the desert completely autonomously. Nobody was in the car. The first year, several teams entered. The winning team, remember this is a 150-mile course, made it 7 miles before it ran into a ditch and its tires caught on fire. That was a winning team. Not a great start. The next year, they ran the contest again. Some more teams entered, and that time, several teams completed the entire course. All but one team made it further than that 7-mile mark. That was the first year's record setting. So huge improvement in just a year. Next slide. Then we move on to the DARPA Urban Challenge. So this was quite a bit more complicated. They were driving through an abandoned military base that they recreated as a synthetic suburb. They had human drivers driving around, interacting with the robots. There was one minor fender bender where the Cornell team and the MIT team were both trying to go around each other, and very low speed collision. But overall, we can consider this a pretty big success, and like a lot of progress from the initial tires on fire episode just 2 years earlier. Next slide. All right, so DARPA kind of wrapped it up, moved things on, and then Google hired a bunch of these people to come join and start working on self-driving cars within Google. I had been at Google the entire time and joined as the cloud guy. Where I hope I've made some good contributions. So initially, we set ourselves the goal to drive these 10 100-mile routes without touching the steering wheel, gas, or brakes. These were quite difficult, but ultimately pretty boring. So it would be like, if you've ever been to Silicon Valley, we drove down El Camino for 35 miles in a row. Nobody does that because it's terrible and boring, but it was a good demonstration of the capabilities you need to drive as a robot car. This was before deep nets existed, so we didn't have any of these fancy ML models that you guys use today. We had a LiDAR and 2 sticks to rub together, and we got this to work. Next slide, then moved on, decided, well, how do we turn this into a product? And so one thing we looked at was doing a freeway autopilot style product where we would mostly drive and then expect the human driver to take over. But we did a lot of user studies, and we would take Googlers and say, hey guys, this is a developmental system. You really need to pay attention while you're driving. It is not perfect. And we took video recordings of what they were doing, and it was honestly pretty terrifying. Other companies may have continued down this path, but we did not. We decided that really the responsible thing to do was to aim for full end-to-end what is called L4 autonomy. So you do not have to drive at all. You can sit in the back seat and the car will get you from door to door.
This guy's sleeping, right?
They're sleeping. We saw someone with like 2 laptops in their lap, like all sorts of terrible things. Next slide. All right, so with that in mind, we've been developing L4 since, the beginning of this project, and we've had some pretty good accomplishments. We've driven millions of miles autonomously with nobody behind the wheel. We've done billions of miles in simulation. Most of the development we do, actually, most of what we do, whole thing, is evaluation, right? So I think you guys are all familiar with what it's like to actually do innovation and scientific research. Having the idea is one thing, but actually validating it is where most of the hard work comes in, and that's what we spend all day doing. All right, so quick digression on how this stuff all works. First off, we got a ton of sensors. I'll go into them in detail. So the first one, LiDAR. So this is a laser rangefinder. It's really great because it can give you an exact 3D point off of a lot of objects. We're getting millions of points back per second. It spins around at 10 hertz, and it's a really rich piece of information. And that's useful for seeing like, oh, that thing is shaped like a bicycle or a person, pedestrian, a car, a truck, school bus. Gives you just a really rich piece of information. Now, radar. Radar is really useful because it has a different failure mode from the other sensors, LiDARs and cameras. It can see through fog. Because of the Doppler effect, it can give you a direct measurement of velocity. It's really useful to know how fast something is moving. It has its own problems with stationary objects, with things that are not reflective of radar frequencies, but it's incredibly useful and really pairs well with the other sensors. And then we have cameras. In the very beginning of the project, we used cameras for only one thing, and that was traffic lights. You can do lots of things with LiDARs and radars, but it cannot tell you if a light is red or green. Can't even tell you if it's lit up, but a camera can, and cameras are really good at that. Of course, there's been a lot of development in AI, computer vision since then, so now we use the cameras for lots of stuff. And there's a whole sensor fusion problem. How do you take these 3 different sensor modalities, shove them all in together into one big box, and out comes a unified understanding of what's going on in the scene. So to tell you a little about how that all plays together, next. So the very, very basic process of how this all works, we start out with a map. People can say, oh, that's a crutch, maps or whatever. They're useful, right? And we're aware that they are tedious to build. That's actually one of my teams. But they're useful, and so you might as well have them. Why not? So we start off with a map. We have to figure out where we are. Next slide. Then we observe where all of the things are around us. We take all those sensors, and we have to turn them into structured data. So like, here's a bunch of laser points and some blue pixels. That is a car. It is moving 15 miles per hour away from us, and his blinker is on, or whatever. From that, we then need to predict where everything is going. It's not enough to just know where things are, but you want to know where they're going to be. Next slide, and then we decide where we're going to drive. Ultimately, all that stuff goes into steering wheel, gas, and brakes, and that's sort of the end of the story. All right, I could have just shown you videos the whole time, but let's just walk through this one. All right, so this just kind of shows you how complex this all ends up working in the end. This is us driving through a construction zone. It's not that big of a deal for us. We do this stuff multiple times a day, all the time. But what you're going to see is someone directing traffic, holding a stop sign. He eventually waves us on. We're reasoning about this whole thing 100% autonomously. So that's sort of the level of sophistication we've reached here. This is a real thing. And if we can go to the next slide, it's a real product. So we have launched a service called Waymo One. If you're in Phoenix, you can just download the app, start taking rides. In San Francisco, we're pretty close to that point. We've taken everyone off the waiting list. My wife and 4-year-old take this around town all the time because parking in San Francisco is terrible. Also, your car gets broken into. It's just a real product. And I want you guys to appreciate that this is, I think, arguably the largest deployment of robots interacting with human beings in an uncontrolled environment. We went from, yeah, I added enough caveats, you have to say yes. That's a really big accomplishment. And it's doing so with an incredible safety record. So I'm really proud of everything we've gotten. And then I would love to take questions, and I'm hoping we got the trolley problem out of our system this morning.
What about semis? Because this morning we heard that freight is going to be an even better application, but obviously the first 2 are not freight. So
yeah.
What's going on with that?
So we had been working on freight systems. We've put that on pause to focus on the commercial ride-hailing product. We hope to get back to it someday, but in these economic environments, you want to focus on one thing at a time.
Why was the decision to make that? Because Uber and Lyft had done so well, so you could just see yourself?
We're just much closer to a product on the ride-hailing part.
Isn't it harder to do this than to do freight?
They're different. So the hard thing about freight, so Most of the time, it's pretty easy. You're going in a straight line on the freeway, just like don't hit the guy in front of you, and you're a pretty good truck driver. The problem is what happens when something goes wrong. You have a lot of kinetic energy in a truck, and stopping them is very difficult. You need longer range sensing. So there's a lot of things that just make it different. It's not easier or harder, just different. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think are like the biggest unsolved challenges at this point? Self-driving.
Yeah, we've got lots of first off, shout out to Matt Thrasher, who is also a product manager at Waymo, RSI 99. We have a lot of problems we're still working on, but at this point, I think we've proven that this can work. I mean, driving in San Francisco, maybe Boston or New York are harder, but it's about as hard as it gets in the United States, so that's pretty good. It's not Mumbai. At this point, we need to turn it into a product. We're working on cost down, trying to get the economics right, so typical business stuff. That's really important. We're absolutely not done with the science part of it, but this is approaching commercial viability, and we're running a product, so we're working on that.
This is the economic piece, the business
Yeah,
case.
exactly.
Really,
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about the different economics from passenger transport like this versus selling driving cars to individuals?
Yeah, so one reason to start with this modality, besides the fact that it is still a developmental product and it helps that we can sort of tune up the cars and touch them on a regular basis, it helps spread the economics over a larger number of people. If we were to sell a car like this, one, we would have to solve the maintenance problem a little earlier than we otherwise would, but also one person would need to buy that for themselves, and only one person or maybe their family would benefit from it. Whereas if we're running it more in a taxi-style service, then we can spread that over many, many people, and the car, like the capital, is being utilized at a much higher rate. Yeah.
And along with that question, I was going to say, have you noticed people using it just for the novelty effect? Has it become like tourist attracting, hey, let's go to San Francisco so that we can try this Waymo?
Yeah, absolutely. That's not really the customer base we want to build for the long run, but absolutely we see it. If you just glance through Twitter or Instagram, there's plenty of that.
Yeah, percentage-wise, do you think the number of people who are like your wife and kid compared to the ones who are actually just tourists who are purposely choosing it over you?
Yeah, I think percentage-wise it's pretty low. We're newer in San Francisco than Phoenix, so we can look at Phoenix as a more mature market, and we're tracking all the usual product metrics like retention and 30-day actives and all that stuff. And it definitely looks like people are using this as a real way to get themselves around. Yeah, Doug.
What's the impact of the map fidelity? Put another way, like what is the constraint to scaling this to more cities, and how much does the quality of the underlying mapping data drive the quality of the underlying drive product?
Yeah, so the question is around map fidelity and how much does that matter? It matters. They're related in an obvious way. This is not the bottleneck to the project. If that was the thing we needed to do to scale the whole thing, then we could do it. But might as well. Yeah.
So I looked at the Bay Area and I mostly see them as Jaguar I-Paces. Is
Yeah.
there a rationale behind that particular car?
So when we were the question is, why are they I-Paces? Why did we pick that one? At the time, when we were selecting our next vehicle, the vehicle before that was a minivan. We wanted an electric vehicle. And at the time, the electric vehicle manufacturers were Tesla, who probably didn't want to work with us, GM, who has their own self-driving car unit, and JLR had the I-Pace. And so the I-Pace was a really good partner, and they've been great to work with. Yeah.
Does a 10-year-old need to learn how to drive?
Does a 10-year-old need to learn how to drive? I suspect it is not strictly necessary. I mean, we've already seen that people are getting their driver's licenses later and later as socialization has moved online. It's less important to be able to drive yourself, and you can take an Uber. It's expensive for a teenager, but it's possible. So certainly for a 10-year-old, I would think this is all pretty on track for them not to have to be able to drive. Yeah.
How scalable is the system? Meaning, if you move to a different city, how much work do you have to do from scratch, and how much can you duplicate?
Great question. It used to be pretty bad, but now it's pretty good. And we learned this lesson when we moved to LA. So that's one of the latest cities we've been driving in. We basically didn't do any tuning to LA at all. We found a couple of things that, let's see, an example would be we've been driving in Austin, Texas, and Austin, Texas has horizontal traffic lights that none of the cities we have driven in before have horizontal traffic lights. And that's a thing we need to add to the system. And every city is going to have like a little quirk like that, but driving is driving, right? And we've built a generalizable system, and it generally works pretty well. Yeah.
You touched on how the original intent was this would reduce accident rates. Do you have any kind of insight into how, after building out the system in the two cities, how that compares with human accident rates?
Yeah, so the question is around comparative safety to human drivers. We've done lots of studies on this. Like, this is something we're evaluating. Like I said, this is the majority of what the internal effort is, but we've published a couple of studies around this. We also have to publish any accident data, whether we hit somebody or they hit us in California, and every indication is that we are doing better than humans. Like, the simplest statistic is that we get rear-ended way more than we rear ended anything. So,
Just because you
yeah.
just drive really slow.
You might think that, but I've watched plenty of these videos where people are definitely looking at their phone and driving in the back of us. So, yeah. All right, well, it looks like we're out of time, but thank you, everybody.